Dear colleagues, welcome to the award ceremony on the occasion of the first Ronald F. Inglehart Best Book Award on Political Culture and Values. This award was introduced by the Worldwide Survey Association in 2022, and today we have the honor and the pleasure to announce the first winners of this competition. We will start now with the award ceremony, which then will be followed by a keynote lecture of the winner of the award. The Ronald F. Inglehart Best Book Award was introduced by the Worldwide Survey Association to commemorate the memory and scientific legacy of the founding president of the association, our dear friend and colleague, the late Professor Ronald F. Inglehart. Ronald F. Inglehart was the founder and the first president of the world-famous World Value Survey for more than 30 years until 2013. He created and directed the World Value Survey, which developed and expanded thanks to his outstanding academic leadership to the biggest social science survey research program in the world. Together with the WVS as a research program, Ron Inglehart created also the biggest social survey infrastructure in academic survey research, with national teams of leading scholars in more than 120 countries and societies in all continents across the globe. Ron Inglehart created and established a global network of scholars and researchers from more than 200 universities, research institutes, think tanks, and survey institutes. The biggest survey research program in the social sciences worldwide had its institutional academic base and center at the University of Michigan under the leadership of Ron Inglehart, who served as Löwenstein Professor of Political Science as well as research professor at the Center for Political Studies during his success story as a true giant of modern political and social sciences in this excellent American university. Ron was one of the most cited political scientists in the world, with more than 140,000 citations in other academic publications, a Hirsch index of 120, and an I-10 index of 369. Based at the University of Michigan, Ron developed an international collaboration with leading universities like Harvard University, Princeton University in the US, the University of Cambridge, University of Southampton, King's College London, University of Aberdeen in the UK, Australian National University in Canberra, University of Sydney, and University of Melbourne in Australia, Leuphana University in Lüneburg, and Free University Berlin in Germany. Also, University Rio Grande do Sul in Brazil, University of Jordan, Qatar University, UAE University, Higher School of Economics in Moscow, Catholic University in Uruguay, Beijing University in Shanghai, Jiangdong University in China. The University of Bucharest, University of Warsaw, University of Vienna, Institute for Future Studies in Sweden, University of Almeria in Spain, Istanbul University, and many dozens of other famous universities and institutes around the globe. Ron Inglehart was not only directing a huge global research program with now more than 500,000 successful face-to-face interviews in 120 countries and societies worldwide, but he also published almost every year an academic book, and his latest book in co-authorship was published early this year in February 2024. His influential and famous as well as best-selling books have been translated into many languages and have been used in hundreds of universities, in undergraduate and postgraduate teaching and learning of thousands of students on all continents. It is our greatest honor and noble duty to continue the great vocation and mission of Ron Inglehart to support, develop, and multiply his legacy in the fields of social and political sciences. To commemorate the scientific legacy of Ron Inglehart and his fundamental contribution into the values and political culture research, the World Survey Association announced the prize that will carry the name of our respected funder. The Ronald F. Inglehart Best Book Award on Political Culture and Values is awarded for a book which makes a substantial and original contribution to theory and/or empirical studies in comparative cross-cultural research. The prize is awarded every second year and honors the best book published in the previous 5 years, following the tradition established by Ronald F. Inglehart. The award recognizes original science research publications, which both develop theories capturing the contemporary zeitgeist and utilize large-scale cross-national survey data monitoring culture to test the comparative evidence. Nominations for the award are open to all scholars worldwide. Nominees do not need to be members of the association. The award is funded jointly by the World Wildlife Association and the family of Ronald Inglehart, represented by Marita Inglehart here. I would like now to give the floor to other colleagues and guests who joined us for the award ceremony today. The first distinguished speaker of our Ron F. Inglehart Book Award is Professor Marita Inglehart from the University of Michigan. Marita, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Christian. And I really am very grateful for this follow-up on the 2022 announcement of the award and the first award that's given. You talk about Ron's citations. I think about the 5 children we have and the 9 grandchildren who all tell me that I should give you best wishes from the family and thank you for keeping Ron's legacy alive. I also feel that I owe a big thank you to Hans Dieter, who chaired the committee that selected this winner here and the follow-up winner of the book award. Hans Dieter, I cannot imagine how hard you must have worked. And Renata, I'm happy to see you here too. I don't see Russ Dalton here, but we all felt that it must have been intensive work for the 3 of you to read 15 books and come up with the best decision for the winner here today. So thank you very, very much. I want to congratulate Pippa, who was such a wonderful colleague for Ron for so many years. Pippa, thank you so much for all the collaborations with Ron, and congratulations for this book award. And we never met before, Dr. Van Beek, but I congratulate you for the second one. I see Alejandro here, and Alejandro is working on Ron's biography, and I'm very, very grateful for all of you who keep his legacy alive. Thank you, and thank you for this wonderful event.
Thank you very much, Marita, for your kind words. For the 2023 award, which is now being presented, the World Wildlife Association has received 15 book nominations. An independent jury was established, which has no links with the executive committee or advisory committee. And this jury bravely assumed the challenging mission to review and evaluate the nominations and to identify the winner and runner-up. The jury members include Professor Renata Siemienska, University of Warsaw in Poland, Professor Russell Dalton from University of California, Irvine, and Professor Hans-Dieter Klingemann from the University of Berlin in Germany. I will now give the floor to Professor Hans-Dieter Klingemann, who served as the chair of the jury, to inform you about the review process, and Hans-Dieter will have the honor to announce the winner. Hans-Dieter, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Today, we celebrate the first presentation of the Ronald Inglehart Best Book Award on Political Culture and Values. This award is, as you have said, given by the World Values Survey Association and supported by the Inglehart family to commemorate the scientific legacy of the association's founder. Awardees are expected to have made a substantial and original contribution to theoretically based cross-national empirical studies in the field of political culture research. Renata Siemienska, University of Warsaw, Russell Dalton, University of California at Irvine, and myself with the Social Science Center Berlin as a home base have served as the inaugural jury to nominate the first winner. 15 books have entered the competition. They were evaluated by each jury member independently. Self-declared interest was carefully observed. The final decision was made after discussing the individual results in a Zoom meeting held April 4, 2024. The award goes to Pippa Norris for her book In Praise of Skepticism. This book differentiates the concept of political trust, a concept that is uniquely important to relate political behavior and political institutions. In addition, the jury proposed an honorable mention for Ursula van Beek's edited volume, Democracy Under Pressure, which is the close runner-up. The volume presents differentiated analyses of the development of democracy, both globally and regional. Results show that sweeping generalizations about the course the future takes and has in store are premature. Congratulations to the winners. They walk the way Ron has paved with his evolutionary modernization theory. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans-Dieter. I would like to ask the other jury members, Renata and Russ, but Russ seems not to be online. So Renata, do you wish to add a few words to the words of the chair of the jury, Renata?
Yes, just a few words. It means, first of all, I agree with Hans-Dieter Klinkerman, and I want to say that it was very nice to work with him and with Russ Dalton. But first of all, I would like to thank for the initiative to establish a award of Ronald Inglehart, because I think that it is very important, because it's not only a question to honorate Ron, what of course should be done, but also these books which were presented and which we read show how different people try to develop and to continue theory which was proposed by Ron Inglehart. And I think that it is very important just to do it to show that the theory which was created in some moment in history is later developed by by people who work further and to continue. And thanks for to Christian Herfer, who was initiating this award, and to all people who supported the initiative, and also thank you for opportunity to work as a member of jury in this competition. Thank you.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much. Now, first of all, I would like to invite the winner of the new Ronald F. Inglehart Best Book Award on Political Culture and Values, Professor Pippa Norris from Harvard University, the author of the winning book, In Praise of Skepticism, Trust But Verify, to respond to the remarks of the jury. Pippa?
Thank you so much, Christian, and to everybody on the jury, in particular, Hans-Dieter and Renata, and of course, Russ as well, because this is a prize which is very much in the footsteps of Ron Inglehart. And it's an honor and a tremendous sense of a pleasure that I should be following in his footsteps. In particular, we worked together early on, as Marita is very aware of, in our collaboration, and we started with our work on gender. And we thought about rising tide and the trends in women's and men's roles and attitudes and values. And that work has really been continuing to be influential in all the studies of things like the gender gap, which are of course ongoing. We worked on religion and issues of sacred and secular and the decline of religiosity, which again is a salient issue which is so critical right now for politics, where again, Christianity and the ideas of religion have come back into politics in major ways. Then we worked on communication, cosmopolitan communication. And then of course, our last book on cultural backlash, about the challenges to democracy, which I'm going to talk about today, and the issues which are facing so many states around the world with the rise of authoritarian populism. So this is very much a testament, not to my work, but to our collaboration and to our work together with Ron Inglehart. And if he hadn't created the World Values Survey, we'd have to create it now. But we have, fortunately, 40 years worth of data, which he brought forward. And the book for which the prize was awarded, In Praise of Skepticism, again, I look back on the trends which he started in the 1970s, when we looked at issues of trust in a wide range of different organizations, and it just built on that by saying, let's think about the agencies and trustworthiness, and hopefully opened up the agenda. So thank you to the awards committee and the jury. Thank you to the World Values Survey. And thank you, of course, to Ron Inglehart for his foundational work, without which none of this would have been possible. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Pippa. An honorary mention has been awarded by the jury to the runner-up, an edited volume which has the title Democracy Under Pressure, Resilience or Retreat, prepared under the leadership of Professor Ursula van Beck. Now I would like to invite Professor van Beck to respond to the remarks of the jury. Ursula, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to second all this praise that has been heaped on Ron, justifiably, for opening a path for so many thousands of, hundreds of thousands of researchers around the world, of which my team and I are part. And I am very pleased and honored, actually, to accept
Have you concluded, Professor van Beck? Yes, I think so. Thank you, dear colleagues. With this, we conclude the award ceremony and proceed now with the keynote lecture of the winner. I therefore invite Pippa Norris to present her lecture, The Cultural Roots of Democratic Backsliding. Pippa is professor of political science at Harvard University in the US and has published many articles and books together with Ron Inglehart. At the end of the lecture, we will have some time for Q&A. I also invite you to use the chat function and post your questions during the lecture. We will review those during the Q&A. And Pippa, the floor is yours for your keynote lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm having a little technical issue, but I hope that that works for you and that you can see the main slides, the cultural roots of democratic backsliding. So is the visuals okay? You can see the slide fine?
I see 4 slides.
You see 4 slides. You don't want to see 4, you want to see 1. So let's shut that one down.
Now we see 1 slide.
Yeah. Well, Ursula is back again.
Yes, I was disconnected 3 times already.
Huh.
We see one angry man.
Yeah.
Pippa, we can't hear you.
Open this up again. I apologize for the technical issues. Somehow we don't have the right thing now.
Now it
Now,
seems to
now
work.
it's okay. Yes, now it's perfect.
Okay, perfect. Okay, then let's start. So, as I said, this is about the next book, which is for Oxford University Press, coming out in spring. And this is critical because so many things are going on in the world. We've just had the European elections. We're going to have the American elections. We've got British and French elections. And all of these are going to see some interesting developments about political parties, and particularly the hard right, which are very relevant for what's going on in the world. So what I'd like to do is ask four topics, four questions. Firstly, what's the severity and scope of democratic backsliding? We often generalize from the case of the United States, but we need to think about how far that's actually relevant to many other countries around the world. And we can think of other cases, the Hungarys, the Turkeys of the world, the Venezuelas, but can we actually generalize from those as well? I'm going to talk briefly about congruence theory and the different explanations we have of democratic backsliding, and then talk about the consequences and look at four cases which illustrate why the phenomena matters so much in the case of Hungary, India, Brazil, and the United States. Four cases from different parts of the world, but where we can start to document the impacts and then talk about the next steps in the research project, which is work in progress. So let's start with the severity of the threat. And what the book does is it asks about these questions and really tries to provide some new approaches to each of these questions. In terms of severity and scope, there's an ongoing debate, which is there. And many of the agencies, certainly who are monitoring democracies, say there's a crisis of democracy, in liberal democracy in particular, a loss of freedom. But recent work has said maybe that's exaggerating the developments. We'll think about the theories. And what I'm going to argue is that we have tremendous theoretical frameworks to think about the rise of democracy and democratization, but our theories about why there's been any decline remain contentious. There's no single driver, and we're not really clear about what's going on. And then think in the last question in the book about the effective strategies and actions to mitigate the risks and to strengthen democracy. And I think that these three questions are ones which are confronting the research community, where the World Values Survey can play a tremendous role in giving us long-term trends and help us to understand in particular these three issues. So what's the evidence of decline? Well, first, there are various ways, obviously, of summarizing that, very different concepts. If we're thinking about Schumpeterian democracy, or whether we're thinking about the variety of different issues in liberal democracy. And what I've done here is simply take the changes as a net change from the turn of the 21st century in the year 2000 through to the most recent data, 2023, in the Varieties of Democracy project. So we can look at Freedom House, we can look at polity, we can look at many other indicators. Anna Meng has developed some new ways of thinking about this, but the Variety of Democracy project has become one of the best academic global networks based on expert surveys to look at change. And we can look at the cases of democratic backsliding, which are below the diagonal. And these are cases between 2000 and 2024, where the VDEM measure of liberal democracy has declined. But then we can also think about cases of democratic gains during this period as well. What does it show? Well, quite simply, if you look at the top right hand of the pattern of the distribution, what you can see is that there are some countries, of course, which have remained extremely stable according to these indicators. And of course, Sweden comes out as top, but also Denmark and many of the countries in the Nordic region, always coming out extremely well, both in democratic culture, for example, support for democracy and satisfaction, along with the actual institutional performance. We see Germany is there as well, Australia. So many of the most affluent countries of the world, of course, managed to stay strong in their levels of democracy, hardly any change. But we can also see a couple of other patterns in that corner. Some countries which are new democracies like Estonia and South Korea, which are third wave democracies, also remain strong and have made some democratic gains in this era. And we can see Lithuania being strong, What about the United States? Well, that's clearly jumping out at us. And it's a case which has had a democratic decline. In this indication, similar to, for example, the Czech Republic before the most recent election, we can see Greece is also seeing decline. We can see Israel, we can see Cyprus, we can see many other countries in that quadrant, countries that were thought of as established democracies, but have seen an erosion. And if we go down the chart, we can see some countries which have in the middle, very different regions, very different political histories, different cultural legacies, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America. And then at the bottom of the quadrant, we see some of the cases which have seen the strongest patterns of democratic backsliding, according to this: Hungary, Poland, India with Modi. But we can also see Brazil with Bolsonaro. And right at the bottom, of course, some of the most autocratic regimes in the world, which have also seen maybe potentially some gains, but also a range of different losses. This is easier to interpret in terms of severity and scope if we look at regional patterns. And here it is worth looking at the United States. According to this measure, the net change in democracy in the United States has gone down about 7% on a 100-point index over these 20 years. We can see a number of other cases in Latin America which are more problematic. Venezuela, obviously, also Brazil with violence, some other countries in Latin America which are very positive. We can see in Central and Eastern Europe some challenges, particularly, of course, under Putin in Russia during this era, where there had been more competitive elections, but Putin has gradually tightened to become more repressive. And we can see countries which have gone down further. And what jumps out? India, under Modi, gone down tremendously in its levels of democratization. Hungary, of course, Turkey under Erdogan, and a checkered pattern if we look at African societies. In particular, sub-Saharan Africa, we can see some countries which during this era have made some gains, but also tremendous losses with coups d'etats in the Sahel region in West Africa. So just as the bottom line, what do we say about severity and scope? Is there a global decline? Well, according to this indicator, what we can see is certainly some countries, some cases are very clearly in decline, but it isn't necessarily universal worldwide. Sometimes we generalize from the cases in the headline and from negative news to the rest of the world, but it's a more complex pattern than that. And we should therefore try to avoid the more popular accounts and try to avoid exaggerating the crisis of democracy, which certainly is clear in some cases, but is not clear in every case. And again, if we just look at the Western democracies of the world, and we look at many European countries, what we can see in cases which have made advances according to this, Switzerland, for example, or Ireland, and other cases which have gone down, in Greece particularly, and the United States, as we can see, is one of the worst cases in Western democracies, but other countries are much more moderate. So severity and scope, let's look at the cases which are best known, which have seen the clearest decline, but let's also think about the broader explanations. When cases have gone down, when there's been an erosion, what's causing it? So here we come to theories of democratic backsliding. And again, the amount of literature, particularly the first wave of literature, was really just calling attention to this and saying that there's been a tipping point, that the period from the 1970s to say around 2000, 2005 was one of advance for democracies. But since then, accounts, in particular influential accounts by colleagues like How Democracies Die, a very strong word, but other works have called about democracy in crisis. The potential explanations, I think, really fall into four categories. And this is where we have to start thinking quite hard about what's going on. The first set of explanations turns to contingent historical events and the rise in particular of particular individual leaders and their elite acolytes, their backers and their supporters. And this is work, for example, by Larry Bartels, who looks extensively at support for democracy across Europe in 2023 and says, well, it's not a decline in popular attitudes towards democracy, which remains very strong. Instead, therefore, it has to be the top. And think about the United States. If, for example, in 2015 and 2016, the primaries had moved towards Jeb Bush, rather than the winner in the Republican Party being Donald Trump, if there'd been particular actions, for example, if there were fewer candidates on the center-right, if there had been other changes in the rules, and for example, if certain states in the red belt, including Michigan, hadn't swung towards Trump very narrowly, it should be said, then maybe Hillary Clinton would have come into the White House and would be talking about a very different pattern in the United States. So leadership clearly matters. And studies by, for example, Ben Geat on strongman leaders and what's in common from Mussolini to the president are important, shouldn't be dismissed. Formal institutions, however, give us a more systematic way of understanding cultural backlash and changes in institutions. And in particular, we have work, for example, by Haggard and Kaufman in a very short book, but one which is about backsliding, which is important, which says what's going on is not just individuals, it's societal and party polarization, the rise of the hard right, and the shift to some extent towards a more progressive left. It's executive aggrandizement, in particular countries with presidential executives who seek to expand their power, and weak constitutional checks. And so this essentially describes the changes in the formal institutions, but of course, it can't explain systematically why there should be more societal polarization, why issues from gun rights to abortion should have risen in salience versus it's the economy stupid and patterns of economic distribution. So formal institutions clearly play a part, and we're going to see a stress test on the American Constitution if Donald Trump is elected, or if there's violence in the next 2024 presidential election because of contentious outcomes. So institutions can play a role, but institutions, after all, are fairly static. They don't change primarily in a short-term period unless there's a constitutional change or unless there's a change which can affect the rules of the game. So what about the third set of explanations? And this is from sociology, political sociology in particular. And this says we need to turn to structural conditions in mass society. So here, what we might find are some long-term developments which might have consequences in the demand for certain strongman leaders and which will be supporting societal polarization. So this brings us to the book which I wrote with Ron Inglehart in 2018-19 on cultural backlash, and to many other accounts in political sociology, which says that institutions rest on a foundation of political culture. And so we can argue about the trends in popular resentments and what's the triggers. And this is obviously relating to explanations about threats to traditional cultural values that we emphasize, and the change in the political cleavages which divide parties. Parties used to be essentially distributed across a left-right spectrum based on economics between those who believe in markets and those who believe in a larger role for the state. But the rise of the second Galtan cleavage, as we call it, about cultural values, which is about issues about liberalism versus authoritarianism. It's about issues of xenophobia versus cosmopolitanism, about issues of sexuality, gender equality, and flexibility in fluid gender identities versus those who believe in the traditional family and traditional distinctions between men and women, which does not allow change during their lifetimes. So the traditional cultural values is one component. Xenophobia, triggered by migrants and waves of population migration for more diverse societies, compounded by severe economic changes, economic inequality, and economic downturns. So sociological explanations provide a way of thinking about why institutions have shifted, formal institutions, in other words, constitutions and laws, and then how that might affect particular leaders and the rise of particular leaders. And then lastly, of course, countries are no longer isolated, they're part of a global community, and studies in international relations focus on broad changes in how countries relate to each other, in particular the breakdown of rules-based liberal orders, respect for human rights, exemplified, I think, by the invasion of Ukraine, but also by breakdowns of liberal rights, I think, also in the Middle East right now, and in many other places around the world. The declining power of the United States, a long-term shift in how far they can be a superpower, dominating, in particular, promoting and strengthening democracy, and the rise concurrently of China as an economic superpower, of Russia in its military aggrandizement, and of course, Iran destabilizing the Middle East. And so we see books, for example, by Fareed Zakaria on the age of revolutions. So this is the building blocks, the four explanations, the theories about what's going on, which go beyond a simple description of the trends, but how do they relate to each other? And what's new about this book, which I'm writing on cultural, on the cultural roots of democratic backsliding? So clearly I'm drawing on our collaborative work with Ron, in particular on our ideas of cultural backlash, but then expanding it. And I'm also drawing on many other arguments which were there right the way from the very origins of political sociology. So what I try to do is draw on, in particular, what has been termed congruency theory, which is the links between culture and institutions. And these theories have been around ever since Harry Ekman, and work, of course, in The Civic Culture by Armand and Verber, and by many other early sociological arguments, which always were there to explain changes in democracy, but can actually be used also to explain the reverse patterns as well. So what the book suggests is that congruency, building on these arguments, is one where the cultural values, the norms, the basic principles and beliefs in any society reflect the type of regime which is in power. And this gives us a lovely fourfold typology. So stable democracies, the Swedens of the world. When we look at countries like this, what we can see is what's the performance of the institutions? Are they seen to be working effectively? Is there, for example, a strong and diverse press? Are there checks and balances on the parliament and on the executive body by the legislature? Is the judiciary respected and able to provide impartial and effective adjudications of disputes? Where there's a strong correlation between the regime and how it performs and the culture, the values and norms believing in democratic principles, then the prediction is that you'll get a stable democracy. But of course, we have the other three cases which are equally interesting. Stable autocracies, where there is an authoritarian culture, certain values and beliefs about the importance, for example, about security rather than diversity. Beliefs in the strength of the state and the importance of having a strong leader, and support for basic principles about nationalism and the importance of a strong country. And when that relates to an authoritarian regime, and the classic case right now would be a Russia, then again, you would expect a moderate correlation, a stable autocracy. Of course, there are going to be challenges, but the regime has power to repress any outbursts of dissent, for example, public protests about Ukraine, by imprisoning its opponents, by controlling the military. And in an authoritarian culture, which is deferential towards the leader, then stable autocracy is likely to persist despite changes and challenges. But the other two cases are the ones which are cases which don't fit together. So cases of progressive democratization and an authoritarian regime, and against the poster child, the paradigmatic case could be a Hong Kong, a country which had a strong free media, which had many debates in its legislature, which had effective public administration. But of course, after the handover to China, all of those things were increasingly repressed, but the umbrella revolutions and the protests on the street see that the culture is still one which still favors democracy, despite the repression of the regime in that particular part of the world. And of course, we can also see cases of democratic backsliding, where I'd argue an authoritarian culture has undermined democracy and the institutions. So when we talk about the decline of democratic norms, of tolerance, of the belief that there should be give and take, of bargaining and compromise, where people have polarized into different camps so that their identities come not from society, but from their parties. And they believe that the negative partisanship is the most important reason to vote, not that you like your party that much, but that you hate the other side. And I use hate because hate and anger are very much part of this idea of us and them, which is the quintessence of an authoritarian culture. In that context, where the democratic regime is eroded, for example, in terms of trust in the judiciary to be impartial, or in effectiveness to bargain and compromise in the legislature, or in beliefs that the executive should be limited in its role and should be checked and balanced by the other branches of government, all of those things consolidate the institutions, all of those things erode the roots of democracy. So it's not a new theory by any stretch of the imagination, but I think it helps to overcome either the focus only on institutions, which don't explain why they're weakening, or the focus only on culture, which don't explain how these changes affect the actual institutions and the institutions working. I have a complete model, which I won't have time to go into right now because we're limited in the amount of time which is available. But it basically says, this is the core model of the book, that the changes in liberal democracy are the result of the leaders, particularly the rise to power of authoritarian populist leaders who use populist rhetoric, but in practice try to reduce the power of checks and balances and expand the power of the executive. That in turn relates to elite party polarization, where the disagreements are not about policies, but about the rules of the game and respect for democracy. That's worsened by the failure of constitutional checks and electoral checks on executive powers, particularly where constitutions are rigid and cannot adapt to the new pressures in society. Extreme media fragmentation means we're living in different worlds, and that in turn, of course, relates to mass societies. And it's a cycle, it's a process where all of these things come together. And international forces, of course, and the rise of particular authoritarian regimes in particular regions destabilizes those regions and has a big impact on other countries. I won't go into our work on authoritarian populism because, again, we don't have time. But what I will do is just look at some evidence to give you a snapshot of why all of this matters. And here, what we're talking about, the consequences of the rise of authoritarian populist forces in 4 cases: Hungary, India, Brazil, and the United States. All of these are leaders who have become very familiar. We know in the Netherlands, the success of Geert Wilders, for example, Le Pen in the French elections, currently ahead in the polls for the Parliamentary National Assembly. We know that Trump has been expanding his rhetoric and deepening his threats in terms of if he gets re-elected. And right now the polls are neck and neck. We know Viktor Orban in Hungary. In Israel, the challenges from the far-right coalition, which has been falling apart in cabinet, but nevertheless has been following and has been extreme. And of course, in Italy, the success of Meloni. And the share of the seats won by the hard-right parties, has not been a uniform rise of the hard-right across the European Union elections. There are different patterns, for example, in Scandinavia and the Nordic countries. But nevertheless, in the heart of Europe, in Germany and in Italy and in France and in Hungary, of course, the hard right have done well. We'll have to see what the outcome is of the gamble to run the parliamentary elections in France, but all of this will play out in the next few months. And systematically, the vote share of the hard right has gone up over a long period, but particularly breaking through into ministerial office, breaking through into cabinet in many countries and into parliament. And of course, this is a worldwide phenomenon because we cannot forget the explanations and the reasons of what's going on elsewhere. Modi being slightly checked in the Indian elections most recently, but Erdogan, Bolsonaro, Maduro, and Duterte all following in this pattern, and a rise in the number of populist leaders in power since the end of the Cold War. So why does this matter? Let's just briefly emphasize the consequences. I'm going to look at how we can think about democratic backsliding using a variety of indices in the institutions from the Variety of Democracy project, and I'm using the indicators suggested by Levitsky and Zimblad in How Democracies Die. And we're going to look at changes in the decline in the overall liberal democracy index, growing limits on freedom of expression, the decline in electoral integrity, the polarization index, and the worst challenge of all, the use of political violence. What do these show are the consequences? So these are 4 cases, all of which are paradigmatic cases of authoritarian populism, the rise of executives who've come to power because of these cultural forces, and let's look at the consequences after and before they get elected. These are all authoritarian populist parties. Here's some of my evidence to show the classification. And each of these leaders comes from a party in the top right quadrant, which is that they are, according to experts, willing to challenge and undermine liberal democratic principles, and in the vertical axis are pluralist or populist in their rhetoric. What happens when they come to power? Well, let's have a look at these 4 cases. And first, here are the trends in the Liberal Democracy Index from the Variety of Democracy project over time from 2000 to the most recent year, which is available. And we have the 4 cases, diverse regions, diverse societies, but very similar patterns. First, Brazil. There are challenges for democracy in 2004, 2008, but a fairly, there's opposition, government changes. And what we can see immediately is that there are some challenges before Bolsonaro gets to power. There's been challenges under the previous administration, particularly you may remember the imprisonment of Lula da Silva for corruption charges, but the pattern plummets even further once Bolsonaro gets elected and continues during his period in office before plateauing at a much lower level. We have yet to see whether Brazilian democracy is going to recover under the current leadership of President Lula da Silva. But again, there are major challenges facing that country. Hungary, of course, we can see here that there was an early period of liberalization. And in 2010, we know that Viktor Orban got elected, changed the constitution, changed the electoral system, became much more repressive on free media and pluralistic criticism. And we can see it plunging right the way down until it's a very low level indeed. India, we can see another case with the BJP, a country which had, where the BJP had been isolated in its early years based on Hindu nationalism. But again, when Modi comes to power, we can see the slide in religious tolerance, in the rights of Muslims, in the free press, for example, through censorship, in civil society, and outbreaks of violence and protests. And in the United States, well, the United States has been changing in the period before 2016 and the election of Donald Trump. But we can see that there were challenges which, in fact, we're seeing a modest improvement, particularly under the Obama administration in terms of levels of liberal democracy, before plummeting under the 2016 to 2020 era. And then we can see again in the most recent period that there has been no recovery. And the no recovery reflects the pattern in Brazil. In other words, things can go backwards, but it's very difficult to make them go forwards. Well, let's just look at the more recent period, and let's look at the changes underneath this before then coming to some conclusions. In Brazil, we can see here are the trends in freedom of information, which is about media. It's about a variety of different sources of information. And we can see that it was declining in the era before Bolsonaro came to power, but it goes down further and doesn't recover. In Hungary, it steadily declines after Viktor Orban comes to power in 2010. In India, it slides dramatically with censorship from the state and attacks on journalists. This has been one of the worst years, by the way, for attacks on journalism worldwide, according to a number of international monitors. And the number of journalists who've been killed in Gaza has broken records in terms of previous conflicts. And in the United States, we see a decline, not so severe, of course, because, of course, the free press has been one of the strongest traditions in America, but nevertheless, a decline with attacks on journalism, along with some other increases of sporadic violence and structural problems of the press, in particular, the decline of the local press and state newspapers, which have had an economic model which hasn't been effective. So a media which is under strain. Electoral integrity. If elections fail, it's not simply Darwinian notions of liberal democracy which fail, but also, of course, Schumpeterian notions. Because if you don't have free and fair contests or clean elections, then, of course, there's no trust in the process and there's no peaceful succession. In Brazil, we see challenges before Bolsonaro came to power and a slight recovery, but from a lower point. In Hungary, a decline. And in particular, the new electoral system brought in 2010 meant that opposition parties, even when they came together, had real problems in achieving any electoral success. In India, a decline, more violence at the polls, more corruption at the polls, the use of money in politics, and suppression by gangs against opponents, threats to electoral officials, and of course the United States, where we see the clear decline from 2016. And the indicators are very worrying: attacks on electoral officials, threats to the outcome, and the Republicans as a whole, not just Donald Trump, but the whole party, engaging in electoral denialism as the tenet of faith to be a Republican nowadays, and the former President Trump saying that he may not accept the outcome of the election as free and fair if he does not win. So that has not gone away. It's got worse since he left office. And under Biden, there have been no effective reforms to the major structural issues in American politics, which are such a problem, from gerrymandering through to the role of money in politics, through to trust and confidence in the election. And Republicans continue to say that Biden is not the legitimate president of the United States. About 70% or 2/3 of Republicans in poll after poll say that. And lastly, the worst threat is political violence. Now here, there is more mixed evidence. In Brazil, for example, electoral violence was worse before Bolsonaro got elected, but then it stayed high. In Hungary, there has not been an outcome of greater electoral violence, as the violence index indicates, but that's because there have been other mechanisms which Orban has used, and so contentious protests have been suppressed. In India, violence has got worse, a lot worse under Modi, and in the United States, a country where guns are everywhere, where even modest changes like the law, like the executive decision to remove guns with bump stocks, in other words, machine guns, has been overturned by the Supreme Court on specious grounds. We can see violence has gone up. Now, there is a slight decline in the very last period from the midterm elections, but I don't think that's necessarily going to be a sustained decline by any stretch of the imagination. And the consequences are problematic. These are the kind of social conflicts that we see in every country where authoritarian populists have risen to power. And the last thing to emphasize is it's often the second administration where some of these things have got worse, not the first. In the first administration, basically the leaders are still learning the rules of the game, and protests and opposition is quiescent on the grounds that there's be a regular rotation in the next election. By the second and third administration, that's when violence, whether it's in Brasilia, whether it's in India, or whether it's in other parts of the world, gets worse, emphasized, of course, by the insurrection of January the 6th, and the lack of ability for America to get over that. So to conclude, we're doing many other things to move ahead on this agenda. And so it's all work in progress. This isn't the last step by any means. It's opening up an agenda to try and integrate our explanations. And we're getting new data. So we're in the field with the World Values Survey 8, and we have our project for the European Union on True Dem. And in particular, these are the things which I think we need to do better. We need new measures of support for authoritarian principles, norms, and leaders. We have 101 indicators on how far people are satisfied with democracy. We have very few about whether people genuinely believe in authoritarian values and norms and their leaders. So we're expanding our questions, we're expanding our societies, hopefully. We need to expand to a wider range of authoritarian states. And we're doing some survey experiments on leadership popularity. Here are some of the questions we're starting to ask about principles for government, about agreement or disagreement with statements which do not include the A word. They do not include a reference to authoritarianism, but they're very much about issues of authoritarian values. The leader of our country should be able to override the judges. It's all right for political leaders to control the media. The use of occasional violence by police can be justified. The leaders should be able to overrule parliament. Political leaders can go above the constitution to maintain order. These are the principles of authoritarianism which have been taking over in many parts of the world, and we need to measure it far more than we have in the past. The agenda has been very much on the rise of democracy in the third wave, but the new agenda is seeking to explain the cultural roots that are supporting both parties and leaders who advocate more authoritarian solutions. So that's the book, that's what the project is about, and I hope it's of interest, and I apologize if I've gone on too long in the presentation. And I'm happy to share further either the slides, because I know I went by very fast, or chapters from the draft if people are interested in seeing more. Thank you very much, Christian. Thank you very much to everybody, and thank you very much to the jury for the award. I hope that gave you a taste, and to Marita as well for the kind words at the very beginning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pippa, for this very interesting presentation. And the floor is now open. I think Professor Russ Dalton joined us in the meantime. If you wish, Russ, you can add a few comments, or we open the discussion. It's up to you, Russell. Can you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Sorry I came late. The calculator on time was off by an hour. Go ahead with the discussion, but it's great to see Pippa.
Nice to see you, Russ. Thank you for the...
Thank you, Russell. Okay, then we open the question and answer session. Please raise your hand or online or with your real hand, and give your statements, question to Pippa and to all speakers so far. Please go ahead. They're all impressed by Pippa's talk.
I'd love to have Christian Belzel, who works very closely in some of these issues and thinks very deeply about it as well. Any thoughts on things that I've exaggerated or I've underestimated in thinking about these issues?
Actually, not at all. Sorry, I just came in 5 minutes ago, so I only got the very, very last part. I had exactly the same problem as Russ, so my timer was off. But I know the draft you sent me, and we are completely on the same wavelength. You have seen the pieces that I have written about regime culture misfits as drivers of regime change, and exactly as you say, those misfits can also go in the opposite direction. So I think maybe this is one aspect you could mention in the book, and also relating to the recent article from Levitsky and Way about democratic resilience in the Journal of Democracy. I think what happened in the 1990s when the Cold War was over, that many countries overized because the international arena was so favorable for democracy for a short period of time, actually not more than 15 years. So accession countries to the European Union, like Hungary and many other countries, became more democratic than the culture would actually support. We saw this already when Ron and I had the 2005 book. We had one graph where we plot the Freedom House scores at this time on the vertical against self-expression values on the horizontal. And we had some overachievers on Freedom House scores, and those included Hungary, Poland, Romania, and Russia. Yes. And now they are back to the regression line, so to speak. So back regression to the mean, as we usually say. So I think this international aspect might be something. Maybe you have mentioned it, but I wasn't there. So this could be something.
Yes, Christian, I mean, I very much agree. And it also reflects my own work when I was working at UNDP years ago, when I headed up the democratic governance practice in the UN, in UNDP. And we always said there at the time, it was in the mid-2000s, 2004, 2005, 2006, when I took a sabbatical from Harvard. And we always said we worked with the cooperation and the encouragement of the country itself. But we talked to the government, and the government knew that resources from UNDP came from doing a certain set of things. For example, having in gender quotas, which were very fashionable and which they knew could increase the number of women in parliament, trying to have elections, even though the capacity to run elections was often sometimes very flawed, but again, trying to do that. And to some extent, having a legislature with competition, even though the parliament itself had very little capacity either to check the executive or to do things effectively. So they knew that if they ran through certain things, they would get certain carrots. And, you know, the financial rewards from the UNDP were substantial. So what happens is that institutions can be introduced, and Afghanistan is the classic case in point. And at the time, everybody celebrates. And so we had the Walisa Jirga, and they adopted a constitution, and they had elections, and they had women in parliament, 28% and so on. And we thought, well, that was progress. But of course, if the cultural roots are strong, and the strength of authoritarianism and patriarchy in that society is so strong, with no experience of democracy in the past, with a very, very poor society, with tremendous economic inequality, with tremendously strong religious roots as well, it's very difficult for the institutions to succeed without those foundations. And in a sense, of course, Chris, we always knew that from the period of post-colonization of the 1960s. After all, Sam Huntington talked about the reverse wave in that era, and that was when countries had become independent from France, from Spain, and from United Kingdom, and they felt that they should adopt the same type of institutions as their mother countries, so elections, parliaments, and so on, of course, only to fall to strongman leaders at the time. So reverse waves are nothing new. Huntington always told us that. That's the best thing he ever said, more or less. And this reverse wave follows that pattern. And those who only look at the institutions, or they only look at the leaders without explaining the culture, whether it's because of discipline or because they're the most visible aspects, or because cultural evidence is still lagging behind these developments, I think are losing the real explanation of what's going on. It's the interaction of the institutions and cultures. The last thing, Chris, is that we've been exploring the residual method to try and get at patterns of trust and trustworthiness. The residual method is a very simple method which says there's an element of performance, how the institutions work, and you can regress that on cultural attitudes. And if the residual is small, then that says there's a match. If the residual is large, it says there isn't a match. The residual can be positive or negative, depending on kind of over or underachievement. Well, of course, it's not just trust, it's democracy, where we can use this beautifully as well. And so you can basically do a nice model you take for either good governance or democracy or a variety of other indicators, the free press and so on, and regress that on public attitudes. And then again, you can see whether the public is further behind the institutions or ahead of the institutions. And I bet without doing that in Hong Kong, you'll find the public is ahead. They're more democratic than the institutions allow. And in other countries, there will be the reverse, where there's a stronger residual the other way. And a case like South Africa is not one you mentioned, but I think that had democratic institutions, but the actual public has been somewhat more reluctant to embrace that to some extent because of other values. So I think we can do a lot to get out of just looking at survey data in isolation without looking at institutions, and get out of just looking at institutions without looking at culture, and build bridges across these different parts of the discipline to understand this complex phenomenon.
Maybe I can add one small thing here. You might pitch your piece a little bit against this one article by Waldner and Lust in the annual review of political science, where they actually were very explicit to say that cultural theories of democracy have little to offer.
That's right.
To understand backsliding mechanisms. I think they are completely wrong. And it is actually the case, I think, that for a while, especially in the 1990s, and probably Fukuyama's End of History was the climax of this attitude, that democracy is kind of detaching from its societal framework conditions, and it's spreading everywhere by a force of nature, because it's expressing a universal human desire for liberty. When we ask for the authoritarian features you mentioned without using the A word, many people are in favor of authoritarian principles. So it's not so universal, and it has societal framework conditions. And we are now getting more and more aware again that socioeconomic, of course, as well, but cultural framework conditions are extremely important.
Absolutely. And Christian, you're doing a great job here as a kind of discussant for the even though you didn't hear the paper, because we always work so closely together. But this also reminds me that there's a tremendous bias in our, a normative bias in our empirical work. And so use of the word crisis and the use and the decrying of democracy is very much from the liberal perspective. But I think it really has meant a progressive view of history. It wasn't just Fukuyama. Everybody kind of succumbed to the idea that we're going towards a more democratic world, and the world is moving in one direction, and history is going to end up like us rather than like them. And we haven't taken seriously the idea of authoritarian legitimation. Authoritarian legitimation is where the popular culture really wants to have a strong leader because they're worried about security threats. They're worried about them and us. They're worried about their own basic survival. And I'm not simply repeating Inglehart's classic arguments about postmodernization, but that when one thinks about, and I think about cases like Gaza and Israel right now, and what's the conflict going on there, and clearly there are all sorts of deep roots which are happening, but what's happening in particular in Israel seems to me very much as an existential crisis, that Israelis certainly feel that they're under threat as a country, as a society, as a culture, by a variety of military threats. And that perspective is very much open then to saying, well, democracy is nice, but it's a luxury good. It's something that we have to set apart. And if we have to basically go ahead with a hard right agenda and essentially not understand Palestinians and not even speak Palestinians, then we need to really think through some of our notions of authoritarian legitimacy.
Yes, maybe if I can ask also a question about Hungary versus Poland. Hungary seems to be the gold standard of decline and authoritarian regime. But why was this backsliding temporarily stopped now in Poland? Do you think it's a temporary stop by some coincidence, or can it go back to backsliding in Poland? So, because you have these theories, so how do you see the Polish case?
So one of the challenges, Christian, of writing this book is that there are so many international developments which are going to occur between the time of submission of the manuscript and the outcome. And it's very dangerous to write instant history or ripped from the headlines journalism. Commentators can do this as a media all the time, and they don't care because their newspapers will be thrown away. But with a book, we need to be far, far more cautious.
Yeah.
So I think the Polish case, the jury is still out, although I very much defer to our colleagues from the region, like Renata, who can talk much more about the region. But I think that Donald Tusk is certainly wanting to restore the tradition and restore some of the institutional changes, but it's very, very difficult. And a classic case, the one I'm living through right now in America, is Joseph Biden's presidency. So you can think through everybody when 2020 was eventually, resolved, and he was sworn into the White House. Everybody sat back and sighed and said, "Okay, the Republicans will have learned their lesson, and we know that we're going to have a change, and we've got a center-left candidate with a progressive party." That's not a bad thing to do with the Democrats. However, what we can see is that the roots of the things which Trump had enacted institutionally are sticky, they're fixed. Institutions don't change like culture. Culture changes gradually over time, and it can go up and down. Presidential popularity can go up and down. The leader in office can change. We can see changes in the composition of the legislature. That's electoral politics 101, and those do change. Just as the British election is probably going to see the return of a solid centre-left Labour leader with an enormous majority. And we can see that the populist features of the Conservative Party are somewhat tempered, will be somewhat tempered, but we also know that Nigel Farage is waiting in the wings. So institutional changes can occur and are sticky and are difficult to reverse, whereas culture can shift up and down on a kind of normal politics basis. So to get back to your question, Christian, I see Poland and the Law and Justice Party as a temporary defeat for authoritarian populists, but we don't know whether they can reverse the damage which has been done by law and justice. We don't know. Well, we do know that Biden hasn't reversed many of the underlying sentiments in America which have been caused such problems, and we know that far from fading into the sunset and Mar-a-Lago, Trump is back. But again, we don't know what's going to happen in November. Nobody does. And it might be that we have a 2020 election and that Biden wins and that everything goes back to normal. But I mean, nobody in America believes that right now. No liberal believes that right now. They really think that we're facing a period of turbulence, and an unprecedented period of turbulence. And it's rather like authoritarian populists can damage the institution. And it's rather like trust. You can damage trust and trustworthiness. It's far more difficult to go the other way. It's far more difficult to reverse that. So there are many cases around the world where we see an election where it looks as though things are going back to normal. Maybe Modi will be constrained in India, maybe in South Africa with the new coalition, the power of the ANC and the corruption of the ANC will be curbed. Maybe in Israel, there'll be a peace settlement. But I mean, these are lots of maybes, which commentators in the media can talk about. I can't necessarily say that in the book. What I can do is I can look back and say, when an authoritarian populist comes to power, what's the institutional changes? And then over time, in the next 20 years, hopefully we'll have accumulated the cultural evidence from new questions and new ways of thinking about how we measure authoritarianism more effectively. And then we'll have some institutional evidence. But every crisis is an opportunity. These are natural experiments in the world. The problem is we don't want to be living through these natural experiments if you're a Democrat with a small d or a liberal with a small l.
Thank you, Pippa. Are there any other statements, comments, questions?
Yeah, Christian?
Yes, please. Yeah, please.
Christian, may I?
Yeah, of course. Please, go ahead, Hans-Dieter.
Okay. First of all, many thanks, Pippa, for your very enlightening talk. This is a framework to combine political institutions and developments in mass publics, which lends itself to a very general application. And if, for example, you would use this framework to kind of systematize the results that were presented in Ursula von Beek's volume, I think we could make quite a step forward. But On the other hand, to link institutions and behavior, or to theorize about the impact of institutions on individual political behavior and values, is a very old game that we have played, and in particular after, or to explain what happened in Nazi Germany and with the election laws, majority versus plurality, etc. So there is a host of results already which try to link institutions and behavior, and try to predict in which kind of direction it will go. And I think with your very helpful, more aggregate framework that you have shown us today, the interaction between institutions and political behavior is pointing in the right direction. And I'm glad that you have in the world value, in the next round of world value surveys, indicators which would allow us to much more precisely look into this kind of interaction between institutions and values. And I mean, I could go on for hours, but all the kind of discussion between, let's say, presidential regimes and parliamentary regimes, etc., they go in the direction that you have again taken up and given us an aggregate framework for a global analysis. Thank you again.
Thanks. And you're absolutely right that this is nothing new. And in fact, I left out the slide, which I do have on authoritarian personalities, because I don't like the word personality per se, but I do think that the concept of authoritarian cultures is one that's been very fuzzy in the literature. And again, many of us live in democracies, we kind of know it, we've lived through it, and we're familiar with it. The authoritarian culture and the appeal of authoritarian culture is one which is somewhat foreign to many, because of the cultural biases in our own profession and our location and things like that. But the idea of wanting to have a feeling under threat, a feeling under cultural threat, a feeling that the things which you value, whether it's God or whether it's the family or whether it's country, are not necessarily respected by other people, that you are under existential threat of being annihilated, essentially, certainly of being respected in your society. And that you need to have a strong leader who says, essentially, that they are going to support you. It's an us-them world. It's a dog-eat-dog world as well. And they're a strong leader who's going to be able to step in on your behalf and speak for you, but not consult you. Basically, I am your retribution. That's the phrase which Trump uses. And I think there's a lot of populist rhetoric, which has confused everybody. But behind everything, it's this sense of authoritarian appeals. And we just haven't got to grips with it properly, Hans-Dieter, I think. We have to go back to the classics of the 1950s to really understand how this works. And we have to update this much more in our measures. And then hopefully we have now much better measures than we ever had in the 50s. So we can systematically look at a before and after to try and disentangle the timeline on these developments and to see what causes the increase in authoritarian support as a popular culture. And then how far can institutions either weaken or strengthen?
Thank you, Pippa. All right.
Christian's back.
Yes. Oh, sorry, Christian.
I think I'm really curious to see how these new items will operate, where we ask for authoritarian principles without using the A word. I think we made a right step in this direction already with the meaning of democracy battery in the World Value Survey, where we have these 9 different meanings. When we designed this question, I was in contact with Hans-Peter Krisi, because the ESS has also a battery on meanings of democracy, but they only include what we know from the textbooks, what we would summarize under democracy. And they only look which has more priority. Is it free media? Is it a multi-party system? Is it freedom of election, assembly, association? And so But and he said, what we are doing is crazy because we inserted items that turn the meaning of democracy upside down, like obeying your rulers or military rule and stuff like this. But then we were surprised when I did this paper with Helen Kirsch, which was finally published in Social Forces, where we looked at people who have an authoritarian misunderstanding of democracy itself. So actually, it's then in this case, support for democracy is the negation of itself, as paradox as it might sound. And we had really difficulties to get this paper published because all the reviewers said, like, you cannot call this misunderstanding of democracy. And we said, yes, you have to name a thing as what it is. And people have misunderstandings. So, so this was one thing. Another anecdote, just the other week, when we were at this European Open Science Festival in Katowice, we analyzed the trust in science questions. And it was interesting to see, we have 4 positive items about science, all measured on a 1 to 10 scale. And in all countries that we have in the World Value Survey, the distribution is right-hand skewed. So most people are saying positive things about science. But then we have 3 negative items. For instance, science is making our life too fast, or we depending too much on science and have not enough faith anymore. And the same people say that as well. Therefore, it's really important to get the balance. In previous times, we thought when people say positive things about democracy, they will automatically, it means they reject authoritarian principles. That is not true. And if we ask for authoritarian principles, we will not filter this out.
That's right. Absolutely. And again, it's the experience of living through the last few years in America, which has brought this out to me, when we have so many more American surveys now. In the past, people in America, survey analysts never asked about democracy in America. They were asleep at the wheel. They just thought everybody agreed with it. And so why would you ask it? You get like 100% or whatever. Nowadays, there's so many surveys, and the extent to which people are happy to undermine basic democratic principles because of negative partisanship, because of us, them, because it's them. And I do believe that many Republicans, as well as a number of MAGA followers, genuinely believe that democracy is under threat, but they believe that it's under threat because of the Biden administration, because of certain things which they see, which for them are undermining the principles in America. So we need to get beyond this big concept and really unpack some of the core ways that people are happy to undermine these issues. And if you were to ask, for example, would America ever have bans on books, as there have been in Florida? 10 years ago, I'd have said, no, of course not, because of the First Amendment. Nobody's going to ban books in America. It's the land of, quote unquote, freedom and liberty. Instead of which, of course, book bans have been ubiquitous. Librarians have been hounded because of issues of race or gender or sexual diversity or whatever. If you'd have said, would there be other challenges such that people in Congress couldn't agree on certain basic principles on bipartisanship for some bargaining and compromise? I'd have said, no, Congress has its problems. They have parties, but the parties are open. They're umbrella parties. They don't have many strong principles. So of course, in Congress, they can work together, instead of which they haven't. And even basic things, if Biden is for it, then Republicans are against it. The polarization is bitter and almost universal. And there are many other aspects of how democracy works, which you would have thought would American public would not stand for, would not go along with, instead of which we find on both sides that they do. And so when you get down to the nitty-gritty, the basic principles of how democracy works, there's a lot of debate in America right now about what we need to do. So we need to get at that more generally, because I think this is undermining democracy, democratic practices, democratic norms in many parts of the world. People don't necessarily believe in those principles, even if they give credence to the lip service to democracy with a small d.
Thank you.
May I make a short comment?
Yes, please, of course.
Because you just posed question about what happened in Poland and why it happened, because it goes in different opposite directions in the majority of countries when populists are making more influential. Taking into consideration our study, and also when we ask about different dimension of democracy, observing Polish society, for Poles are important freedom. And when Kaczynski and his political party tried to, for example, make abortion, to eliminate abortion, to eliminate rights of people who feel this in everyday life. They were just against, they were supporting Tusk and this opposition, which now is in power. Therefore, we have to be aware that we as scientists operating and using abstract terms which very often people don't understand what it means, because even when we talk of democracy, we can just say that we can communicate and we know about what we are talking. But at the end, we also are aware there is a number of definition of democracy. It is the basic, in a case of Polish society, it is what people who are in power propose people. If they want to limit their freedom, they start to be angry. It is some characteristic for Polish culture for a long time. And therefore, for example, in the election which opposition came to power, young women voted. And they knew why they were voted, because simply it was a question to defend their rights on individual level. And of course, it is, we can say they are different dimensions, economic, social, of course they are. But for people, at least in Polish society, when we can talk about history in 19th century and in 20th century also. And now, if you just try to limit individual rights, and when you just also say about Russian influence as something which can be increased, people vote as they are voting. It means we have to be aware that simply the terms which we consider as very important and which we understand, people often don't understand. They are just looking at what is happening to them personally. And I believe it is also something what Pippa was talking when she talked about culture, because it is a broad term, but it's a question which part of the culture push people to react in some way and to fight for something. We had this huge demonstration, which were just against this people who were Kaczynski and this party, which was in power, because people who were taking part in the street demonstrations, they were saying, we are coming to this demonstration to defend our rights and rights of our children and great children, especially our daughter. And, they were in this way.
Thank you, Renata. Thank you very much.
Well, may I add
Yes,
a
please.
footnote?
Please.
All this discussion that we have heard is pointing in the direction that we have to devote much more time to methodology. Let me give you one example which illustrates, I think, the point. We have, in the old days, always tried to believe in concepts like party identification and things like that. And the Michigan school had one question, which was an open question on the good and bad aspects of political parties, where no answer categories were presented, but people could use their own terms to respond. And I did that in Germany for many of the federal election studies. And what the outcome in a nutshell is that if you ask people, what are the good points of the, let's say, the Christian Democrats, they come up and tell you 4 or 5 reasons. And when you ask them what are the bad points of the Christian Democrats, they also give you a couple of reasons. And this points, first of all, to this old saying that voters are no fools. They can distinguish good points and bad points of political actors. And the outcome of the analysis, if you subtract the positive and the negative points that people have, is that you can predict a concept like party identification almost perfectly. So what you have is you cannot measure black and white. You have to give people an opportunity to express good and bad aspects of certain political objects.
Thank you, Hans-Dieter. I think we have to come slowly to a close because Professor Inglehart has to go to your next lecture. If there's no urgent comment, then I would draw to a close. I would like to thank Professor Marita Inglehart and the Inglehart family for generously supporting this Inglehart prizes. And we're very grateful for your intellectual and also material support of our awards and prizes. We thank you very much and your family. This is a long-term commitment and we'll be able to get all these awards and prizes for the years to come. This is my first thank you. The second thank you goes to the jury who was evaluating 15 books, some of 400 pages. They spent half a year to evaluate these books and spend a lot of their life discussing it. I would like to thank Professor Renata Siemienska as member of the jury very much, Professor Russell Dalton also, and the chair of the jury, Professor Hans-Dieter Klingemann. These three sacrificed lots of their time in the last year to get a trustworthy prize, and we got a trustworthy prize and a very good winner. I would like to thank all who made my intervention. And finally, I would like to congratulate Pippa Norris to be the first winner of the Inglehart Book Award, and congratulate also Professor Ursula van Beck to be the first scholar with an important book to be a runner-up. I think it was a successful competition, successful award ceremony. And I thank you all for your contributions. And next time, maybe we do it in person, then we can meet and greet and have a glass of wine, not alone like Chris Welzel, but all of us. And I think well done, and I thank all the involved persons for their spirit, their volunteering, and success. Thank you very much. And I think the whole thing is recorded. So if you want to listen to it again, please feel free to go to our YouTube channel where you can see yourself, hear yourself, and see people again in all excellence of academic outstanding performance. Thank you very much. Take care and see you soon.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Xenia. Thank you.
Yes, I forgot to mention Xenia.